My pleasure to introduce Ben Baker, who's going to be speaking on From Downtown to Chinatown, Material Change and Community Persistence. And okay. Start now.
Slideshow, good slideshow.
Slideshow?
And then all the way to the left.
This one? Yeah. Okay. Perfect. So my presentation, I'm going to jump us forward in time. Largely, let's say 1985 is going to be the major moment where I start talking about the new wave of material culture that is taking over Chinatowns. So I'm going to be presenting some of my research for my master's dissertation, which largely began with the question my supervisor asked me, Ben, what makes Manchester's Chinatown a Chinatown? What does it look like? And this got me thinking, what does the Chinatown look like? How do we know we're entering a Chinatown? And as an archaeologist, I became fascinated with this question, what role can objects tell us when we're thinking about this larger question of what makes a Chinatown a Chinatown? What are the roles of objects in helping us tell the story? And so, to do so, I'm largely going to consider this question. I have divided my presentation into the following sections. We're going to briefly talk about my two field sites. I surveyed two Chinatowns, Manchester in the United Kingdom and Vancouver's Chinatown, where I'm from. And then we're going to consider how Chinatowns have sort of become a cognitive construct that are taking over around tourist discourse in many urban cities. And then I'm briefly going to talk about the ways in which this becomes materialized. So these are my two Chinatowns. On the left, this is Manchester's Chinatown, and as you can see, it is substantially smaller than Vancouver's Chinatown. And this largely has to do with Manchester's Chinatown's history. So throughout the 20th century, Manchester as a city was being ravaged by deindustrialization and economic depression. And in a bid to sort of rebrand the city and hopefully revitalize it, Manchester City Council started using property initiatives to attract incoming Chinese migrants from Hong Kong to move into the city center, to rejuvenate it, and to create a Chinatown. And so this way, Manchester's Chinatown was very purpose-built. It was designed as a way of an economic stimulus package, in a sense, to get the city back on its feet following a series of economic changes. And as others have said, it transformed a series of abandoned textile warehouses into a lively dining and entertainment industry. Now, Vancouver's Chinatown on the right is substantially larger. Now, these borders that I have drawn aren't necessarily reflective of the historic nature of the area, but rather just the ways in which contemporary material culture constructs what the boundaries of Chinatown actually are. Over Vancouver Chinatown's history throughout the late 19th, throughout the 20th centuries, the boundaries of Chinatown have shifted quite a bit, and today this is just sort of what's left. In fact, because of gentrification, you could potentially trim it back down a bit since the area is rapidly changing. And so, in terms of thinking about Vancouver's Chinatown in terms of from a tourism perspective, I'm largely interested in this 20th century moment following the 1936 Golden Jubilee celebration, where for the first time, Vancouver's Chinatown was seen to have a tourist value to the city since it began attracting people from across the globe. And then this was very much solidified in the city's fabric following the World Expo in 1986, where Chinatown officially became part of the city with the construction of the Dr. Sun Yat-sen Classical Chinese Gardens, as well as several other urban heritage initiatives that sought to revitalize the community. And so, but then, why did these transformations take place? And what our Chinatowns actually are? Like, this doesn't particularly tell us that much about them. I like to think of contemporary Chinatowns, especially in the UK, as this convergence between two different perspectives. On the one hand, we have a perspective from largely white populations who have an idea of what they think a Chinatown is based upon largely San Francisco's Chinatown. But then also we have this perspective from the community members themselves who see see the economic potential that Chinatown can bring. And so to think about this, I like to think of this as Chinatowns as a form of self-orientalism in the contemporary moment, or a purposeful orientalizing that uses the conscious deployment of overt material symbols of ethnic difference by the other. And this is a way to sort of regain control of the narrative of Chinatowns. Throughout much of history, Chinatowns were seen as places of vice and depravity, But then through this conscious deployment of material culture, something happened. Chinatowns began to change. They became something of value to urban centers. And in the case of Manchester in particular, the Chinese New Year's festival that takes place draws over 2 million people to the city of a population that typically during the day only has about 500,000 people. So there's a massive surge of people for this week. At the beginning of the year, swiftly depopulates and provides a substantial boost to the city's economy. And so, and self-orientalism also highlights the uniqueness of Chinatowns compared to the wider urban landscapes, largely by tapping into a Western fascination with all things Eastern. So during the turn of the century, because Chinatowns were under pressure for their survival, they needed to rebrand themselves as something, to be seen as something else besides a perceived slum in many of the Western North American cities. And so this enabled them to regain control of their narratives. And in this way, contemporary Chinatowns can be very much seen as a form of commercial Orientalism, which explores the ways in which Chinese things, ideas, and peoples were commodified to gratify a sense for exoticism, for a sense of difference. And you can also, in this moment, connect this to the rise. Anyways, so we can connect contemporary Chinatowns to the next stage of what Pine and Gilmore have called the experience economy, which is essentially the next stage in the capitalist market, which is a shift away from just providing services to providing people with experiences. And in this way, contemporary Chinatowns have started providing an experience for people to get away from the doldrums of a Western city lifestyle and to escape into something a bit more fantastic, that is something reminiscent of an imperial nostalgia for a voyage to the Orient, but then that is still safe because you can take a bus or an Uber or a taxi to get there. And then, but how does this work? And to convey an experience economy, you have to construct very specific purpose-built spaces that are at the result of a series of cross-community collaborations. Now, Manchester's Chinatown, for example, is a great example of this. As I had said before, the city council provided a lot of property tax incentives for newly arrived Chinese migrants to move into the city center to essentially construct this Chinatown. And so through that, Chinatown developed, and still to this day, the Chinatown in Manchester, the property taxes are substantially lower in the area if you are coming to set up a business as a means to attract tourists. Vancouver's Chinatown is doing the same thing, and an example would be the construction of the Millennium Gate, which stands at the entrance of Chinatown, which was financed from a wide variety of different sources. So in this way, it sort of pulls people together to help construct this built environment. And so now we're just going to briefly sort of go through some of the main types of materials that help to create the sense of difference or help convey a sense of experience for people to come and enjoy Chinatowns. Now, one of them are Chinese arches. This is the arch in Manchester. It was put in 1986, I believe, from the Manchester's sister city in China, Wuhan. Many people like to think that the arch is just sort of to symbolize the birth of Manchester's Chinatown, the flourishing of the community. But other people are a bit more critical of this and say it's actually an attempt from the Chinese government to gain support of a very divided British overseas Chinese community pre the reunification of Hong Kong with the mainland. And so right now this arch sort of sits in the middle of Chinatown, what is Faulkner and Nicholas Street. And just right to the beside of it is the seniors' home that was built in 2000, following the teardown of a Western-style hotel. And the seniors' home is actually a very great example of trying to convey a sense of authentic Chinatownness, because there are no permanent residences in Manchester Chinatown, and so what City Council very problematically decided they were missing was older people in the neighborhood to really convey a sense of community. So they purposely built a seniors' home just in Chinatown to sort of give it a more authentic Chinatown feel. So Vancouver's Chinatown Vancouver's Chinatown on the other hand has two different arches. So the top one is what I mentioned before, is what locally we call the Millennium Gate, and the bottom one is what I have recently found out is called China Gate, which is the gate that was used in the World Expo in 1986 to mark the entrance to the China Pavilion. And so the top one was built as part of a new series of reforms in the area to sort of revitalize the area. Vancouver's Chinatown is in a traditionally very economically disadvantaged area called the downtown east side. And so the broader urban environment is really suffering, and so this is part of an effort to sort of revitalize Chinatown and very much separate it from the problems associated with the rest of the city, but you can ask me about that later. And so these two gates are on the main tourist corridor, Pender Street, which is the main artery filled with shops for people to come walk down. So when you are walking into Chinatown, you're sort of affronted by this massive gate that stands apart from the rest of the brick or new glass skyscrapers that are constantly being put up around it. And as you can see, the street lamp posts go from they turn red, that all the street posts in Chinatown are painted red, and the fact on top of the lights are some dragons. Well, it's cut off. But dragons are another really great way in which sort of people are trying to convey a sense of difference, to really say this is a different area from the rest of the urban surrounding. And so on the left is this dragon statue in Manchester. I have spent a very long time trying to find out when it was put in and who put it in. But no one seems to know. Most of the answers I tend to get are it just sort of appeared one day. And it's actually just sort of sitting in front of a parking lot that is surrounded by bushes in an attempt to very much say, like, this 4-block radius is a Chinatown. And another great example that really helps convey a sense of difference is architecture. And so the top one is the Chinese Cultural Center in Vancouver's Chinatown, and these bottom two slides, not the best quality. This is a pagoda that is built in the Sun Yat-sen Classical Gardens in Vancouver, and here is a fence that is right behind the dragon statue in Manchester to sort of block off this very ugly parking lot that is in the middle of the area. And it's painted red, and it's sort of is shrouded with trees. There's a lot of bamboo in Manchester's Chinatown. And this is all part of the way to say this is a different area than what one is normally walking into. And so in this way, the material culture of Chinatown helps create spatial boundaries. These are just some other examples of lights. This is in Manchester's Chinatown, of how these are hung only in Manchester's Chinatown. In fact, as soon as you turn a corner into the area, and when you look up, just between every building is a series of strung up of lights, sometimes with the cat figures, sometimes with Chinese characters for good luck and fortune, and this is all throughout a 4-block radius. It's very bright at night, because all you can see are these hanging lights that weren't put in properly by City Council and do sometimes fall when you're walking through them, which is a very interesting phenomena. So in this moment, Chinatowns are purposely separated from the city at this moment in the 1980s in both Manchester and Vancouver as a way to sort of provide an economic stimulus to the region. But in both cities, something interesting is happening. We're actually now at a moment of critical juncture. In Vancouver's Chinatown is currently under threat from very rampant gentrification processes. Celia showed a photo of one of the condos that is recently being put up, and more of them are being put up all the time. Every time I go back to Vancouver, there's always more protests to be signed of, don't let this building go up in this lot, don't let this building be torn down. And in Manchester, it's quite the opposite. The rest of the city is rapidly gentrifying. But the Chinatown itself has essentially been forgotten, is now just this corner of the downtown core that now looks drastically different and isn't being included as much in the city's cultural fabric. When I was talking to someone at the Oral History Archives in the City of Manchester Library, they were telling me how it used to be, there's this 20-year period where Manchester's Chinatown was the place to be for city cultural events, but now that it's recently shifted away to a newly revitalized Albert Square in front of the City Hall. And so at this moment, I think it's important to sort of think what's next for Chinatowns in terms of their material constitution. How are they going to survive this moment in which many of them are being either threatened by gentrification or the lack of urban development? And right now, I have no answers. I am a firm believer in sort of ending with open-ended questions to sort of get a discussion going. And with that in mind, I would like to thank you for listening to my presentation. Thanks.
Ben, thank you so much. And our last presentation today, which will be followed by a good period for questions and discussion, is by Dr. Kennedy, Building a Transnational Approach to Food, Health, and the Environment in Chinese Diaspora Research.